A
Even as
single
its architecture
controversial choice
shifted,
tore street
Big Chief had
outlaws
broken
right
his
down the
silence
middle,
not to
and
ignite
friendships
conflict.
that
The
once
engine
seemed
still roared
unbreakable
under
started
Oklahoma's
cracking under the
skies.
strain.
In the end, what lingered
Now
was
Big
not
Chief is
division but
finally
evolution.
speaking out,
There was no
and what
grand
he's
finale,
revealing could
no
completely
explosive
change
showdown
everything
to
fans
punctuate the
thought they
controversy,
understood about the
revealing
show.
a
The
landscape
silence
altered
before the
but
storm by
intact.
early
Street
fall of
Outlaws continued its
2025, the tension
trajectory
surrounding
as summer
Street
edged
Outlaws
toward
no
autumn
longer
in
felt like ordinary
2026,
racing
followed by
competition.
deliberate speech,
It felt
had
deeply
clarified
personal.
priorities that once
Big
felt
Chief had
entangled in
quietly stepped
expectation.
away from a
He
major
remained visible
production
within the
direction that
racing
many
world,
believed
yet
would
the
shape the
urgency
next
to
chapter
occupy
of
a
the
central
franchise,
spotlight had
and the
faded.
absence
For
of
Big
his
Chief,
voice was
the
ringing
aftermath
louder
was
than
not
any.
about reclaiming dominance
Engine
or
at the
proving
starting
skeptics
line,
wrong,
fans
with
picked apart
supporters
every
and critics
episode,
engaging
every
in
social media
conversations about
post,
ownership,
every missed
and
appearance,
that growth sometimes
hunting for
demands
clues that the
tension rather
rumors
than
were real.
consensus. No
Inside
matter
the
how
Oklahoma
central that
racing community,
personality once
conversations
appeared,
turned
yet the
careful.
narrative had permanently matured.
Old friends who
The
used to
franchise
argue
itself
openly about
demonstrated
call-outs and
resilience.
rankings
The
now weighed every
controversial
word,
decision that
as
once
though
seemed like
loyalty itself
rebellion
had
now
become
revealed
something that
itself
could
as
be
boundary,
negotiated.
and
Some
eventually it
racers
belongs to
aligned
more than you.
themselves with the
That
show's
recognition
evolving
carried
structure,
no bitterness,
welcoming
only
national tournaments
acceptance,
and tighter
acknowledging
production
that building
control.
something powerful enough to
Others
outgrow its
quietly
founders,
wondered whether the raw
instead
heart of
choosing
street
to let
racing
his
was being
actions
traded
speak in
away for
measured
something more
consistency
polished and
rather than
controlled.
dramatic
The
gestures,
center of the
yet still
controversy was a
undeniably
decision that looked
influenced by his
straightforward on
legacy.
the surface.
The crowds that gathered were
Big
curious
Chief
but
chose
supportive,
not to
drawn
participate
not only
in a
by
format
nostalgia
change
but
that
by
would
intrigue,
fundamentally alter how
participating in
races were
independent
organized
events
and
that
how authority
reconnected
was
him with
shared
the
among
raw
the
spontaneity that
cast.
first drew
People
him
on
to
the
racing,
outside, it looked
because
like
standing
resistance to
apart requires a
progress.
different kind of courage
To
than
those
blending
closer
in.
to the
And though no
situation,
one
it felt like
publicly
a firm
conceded
line
fault,
drawn in
there were
concrete.
acknowledgments
Y'all
that
think I just
communication
walked
had
away for
faltered on
no
all
reason?
sides,
He would
and that
later
distinction
ask,
mattered.
his voice
Privately,
calm but carrying
leadership
an edge
roles
of exhaustion.
stabilized,
That
and
question
production
hung in the
maintained
air
its
long
evolving
before he
structure.
ever
And
said
for
it
the
out
first
loud,
time in months,
because
the
beneath
debate
all the
centered less on
speculation
what
was
he
a
had
truth
done
almost no
and in
one
the
had
way his
considered.
name was spoken both online
The decision
and off.
wasn't
The
impulsive.
storm that had once swirled around
It
him
wasn't
began to
driven by
lose its
ego.
sharp edges,
Behind
not an
closed doors,
explosive
the discussions had
reconciliation,
grown heated.
not a dramatic reversal. In the
Contracts
weeks
were
that
being
followed
rewritten.
Big Chief's statement in late June of
Expectations were
2026,
shifting.
the controversy
Production
transformed from
schedules were
conflict
tightening
into
around new
choice,
storylines
and
that
choice,
some
when
felt
owned
valued
publicly,
spectacle
and
more than
rivalries would
authenticity.
continue to
Big
ignite.
Chief had
His
always
words revealed
insisted
that the
the street
decision
should
was
stay
neither
the street,
impulsive nor hostile,
unpredictable,
but
raw,
deliberate and
real.
personal.
Even under
In
the
choosing
bright
to
lights
speak,
of
he
national
reclaimed
television,
authorship of his
weeks
own
turned into
narrative,
months
not to
without any
dismantle
clear
what he helped
explanation.
build, but to
Frustration
define his
hardened
place
into
within
division.
its evolution. By breaking
Comment
that
sections
silence, he
exploded.
did not seek validation,
Some
but
accused him of
understanding.
holding on
The
to power
controversy
too
did not
tightly.
dissolve instantly,
Others
and critics
defended him
remained skeptical.
fiercely,
Instead,
arguing
there
that
was
without
clarity,
his leadership,
and clarity
the whole
often
foundation
carries
would
more
collapse.
impact than
The longer
spectacle.
he stayed
When he
quiet,
finished speaking,
the more the
there was
story
no dramatic
solidified against
proclamation,
him. But
no
silence
triumphant
is
return
rarely
promised,
empty.
expressing hope that
Very
dialogue
often
could
it's
replace
strategy,
division,
or pain,
woven into his
or
life
both.
long
What
before
almost
cameras
no one
arrived.
understood
His
during
choice,
those
he
early
insisted,
weeks was
was
that
not
the
a
choice had
declaration of
already cost him
superiority,
far more
but
than
an act
screen
of
time.
alignment. He emphasized
It had
that he
cost him
harbored no
trust in
resentment
people he
toward
once
those who
considered
chose
family.
differently, no explosive
It had forced him to
confrontation that
ask whether
triggered
the
his
empire
decision,
he helped
because
create
strength
still
had
carried
long
the
been
same
his
values
defining
that
trait
built it
on
in the
screen.
first place.
People think
The
it's
storm
just
was already
racing, he
gathering.
said quietly. They don't
He
see what
simply
it
hadn't
does to your
stepped
head,
into it yet.
including
Fractures
doubts
in the
about
brotherhood
identity
by the
beyond
time
the
winter
show,
arrived at the
about being
beginning of
positioned as either
2026,
hero
the
or
cracks
obstacle in
inside Street
narratives
Outlaws
crafted
were
without
no
his
longer
voice
hidden.
present. As his
What
statement
had once been
progressed,
healthy
the tone
competitive
shifted
tension
subtly
now
from
felt
explanation to
colder, more
introspection,
intentional,
revealing
and far more
layers rarely
personal.
seen
The
beneath his
brotherhood that had
composed
created the
exterior.
franchise,
There were nights when he
built on
questioned whether
midnight street
drawing the
calls
line
and
had cost
handshake
him
promises,
relationships that
was
once felt
splintering under
permanent.
the
The
pressure
hardest
of one
part,
deeply
he confessed,
controversial
that
decision.
statement
At the
reframed
heart
the
of it all
controversy
stood
from a
Big
battle
Chief,
for power,
no
but a
longer
refusal
silent,
to endorse a
but still
direction
not
that felt
fully welcomed
misaligned
back
with the
either.
culture he helped cultivate.
His
But
refusal
each
to
time
go
he
along with the
revisited
new
the
direction
terms,
had
he
opened
felt a quiet
conversations that had been
resistance, a
simmering
sense that
quietly for
agreement would
years.
require
Some
silence in moments when
racers
honesty
believed
mattered
the show
more,
needed
that he
to evolve
considered
to
signing off
survive.
on the new structure to preserve
Others
unity.
believed
Yet
evolution had
changes
turned
that
into erosion
simultaneously
that
constrained betraying
private
the
garages
spontaneity
across
that once
Oklahoma and
defined their
beyond the talk
identity,
turned
rather
blunt.
than
You
scripted
think this was
arcs.
about TV?
He described meetings
One
where
longtime racer
revised
said
contracts
quietly to a
emphasized
close friend.
predictability and centralized
This was about
decision-making.
power.
Was that responsibility
That word
accompanied
echoed louder than
influence,
anyone
explaining
wanted to
that
admit,
influence is
because
often
power had
mistaken for
always been a
ownership,
sensitive
governed more by
subject inside
production
the group
safeguards
Big
than
Chief's
racer
role as
instinct to compete
strategist,
fiercely
list
without
keeper,
descending into
and unofficial
recklessness.
leader had given him
He
real
reminded
influence
listeners
from
that
the very
leadership on
beginning.
the streets had never been about
Now
dominance,
that influence felt
was not
challenged,
losing authority or
producers
screen
had
time,
started
but
amplifying
sensing
new
that
voices,
but on a series of
introducing
gradual
structural
adjustments
changes
that
that spread
accumulate until the
decision-making more
original
widely
group,
and reduced
emphasizing
the
that no
centralized
single person
authority
was
he once
responsible
held.
for the
Rankings
shift,
were being
without
reimagined.
asking what exactly was being
Tournament-style
sacrificed in the
events replaced
process.
organic street
Expansion
calls.
began to feel like
Rules
transformation,
became
and
standardized in
transformation
ways some
began to
felt
feel like
protected the
dilution,
brand, but
because none of
restrained
them
the beautiful
anticipated how
chaos that
far
made it
those
authentic.
late-night
For
street and
racers
left
who had
fans
built their
confused,
reputations
but he
under Big
insisted that
Chief's leadership,
confusion
the
was not the
adjustment
same
felt
as
sudden
betrayal.
and jarring.
The growth of the franchise,
Loyalty
he said,
suddenly
he
became
began by
complicated.
acknowledging the
Standing with
controversy
him meant
directly,
risking fewer
admitting that stepping
opportunities
back
inside
nor
the
wounded
changing
in the
franchise.
theatrical way some had expected,
Standing
but
with the new
measured and
direction
deliberate,
meant accepting
and
a
he
reality
refused to
where
let
his presence was
speculation
no longer
define a
the center.
decision
The
rooted in
emotional cost
conviction.
wasn't instant,
It was not
but
because
it
the
built
pressure
steadily.
became unbearable. Friends
Friendships
urged him
cooled
to speak
without big
sooner.
arguments.
Critics insisted his silence
Text
proved
messages
guilt,
slowed.
and supporters demanded
Invitations
clarity.
shifted.
Yet he waited, knowing that once
Appearances
words were
became
released,
calculated.
they could
The
not be
brotherhood that once
reclaimed or
thrived on
reshaped.
spontaneous
Betrayal,
trust began
financial
operating with
conflict,
quiet caution.
and personal
Big Chief
feuds,
felt it before
none of
anyone
which
said
fully
it aloud.
captured the
Feels
truth he had been
different,
carrying.
don't it?
The
He
rumors had
reportedly
multiplied
told a
beyond
longtime
recognition,
ally after one
pressing
tense
against
event.
Big
The
Chief from
reply
every
was
direction
careful.
until the absence of his
Everything
voice. By the
changes.
time early summer of
That answer
2026
was
settled
honest,
over Oklahoma,
but it cut deeper
it
than
had forced
intended.
him to
Change is
confront
part
whether
of
his
racing,
identity
but
depended on a
change without
platform or on
agreement breeds
one truth
resentment.
became
What hurt
undeniable.
Big Chief the most wasn't
Silence had
disagreement.
shielded him for months.
It was distance.
He was a
Meanwhile,
racer,
fans became
navigating
part
the
of the
uncomfortable
divide.
space. It was a slow
Online
recalibration
arguments
of
grew
presence
heated
and
through late
purpose.
2025
His restraint
and into early
confused critics who
2026.
expected
Supporters
fireworks.
accused
He
certain
did not
cast
retreat
members of pushing
entirely.
aside the
He
man who
attended
helped
select
define the
gatherings.
entire show.
Those questions surfaced during
Critics
quiet
argued
hours
that no
when
single
garages
racer
emptied.
should hold that much
Privately, he
control
wrestled
over a
with doubt.
national franchise.
Had he
The
miscalculated?
split even showed up at live events. Crowds were no longer united in shared admiration.
Seamlessly on screen,
Instead,
reinforcing
whispers
the
carried
perception
undertones
that,
of
meanwhile,
loyalty to
the
different
franchise
sides
continued
for a
evolving.
show that had
This allowed
always
for
sold rivalry
spontaneity,
wrapped in
but it
unity.
also
The
underscored what
irony
had
was
been
painful.
lost. He
Behind
rediscovered
closed
the
doors,
raw
financial
simplicity of
realities
lining up
added
for the
more
sake of
pressure.
it. Was not bravado.
The franchise was
it was
expanding
conviction
into
laced
bigger
with
markets.
uncertainty. Isolation
Sponsors
has a way
wanted
of
stability.
clarifying. A fellow racer asked him
Networks
as
wanted
engines cooled
consistency,
under fading
raw,
light.
authentic
Yet beneath
chaos
the
doesn't
adrenaline
always
lingered a
fit
subtle
neatly into
melancholy.
corporate plans.
Crowd curious
Big
to see
Chief
him
found
race
himself
outside the
facing a
structured
painful
framework of the
contradiction.
show,
The very
and which were
success he
sustained
helped
by
create
shared
had now
opportunity.
produced an environment
One
that challenged
particularly
his place
quiet,
inside
without
it.
trust. Every handshake
Growth had
feels
come at the
temporary.
price of control.
Street
Yet
outlaws had
underneath
always
the tension,
thrived on
something more
rivalry wrapped
vulnerable
in
was
camaraderie.
happening.
And identity
He
does
started
not detach
questioning whether the
cleanly from
brotherhood had
visibility.
ever been as solid
When crowds
as it looked,
gathered without
or whether
chanting his
shared
name,
ambition had
it
simply
struck
covered
deeper than he
fragile
expected.
alliances.
He neither
Success
confirmed nor
magnifies cracks
denied
that
those
once seemed
theories,
small. I
allowing
never wanted to
speculation
be
to
against
swirl
anybody,
without fuel.
he would later reflect.
Behind the scenes, the
But I
psychological
wasn't going
weight,
to
a
pretend
smaller,
everything
more
was fine
persistent
either.
whisper suggested that health
The
concerns
controversial
had
decision
influenced
had
his
become
decision.
much more than a
That the
professional
relentless pace
disagreement.
of some speculated that
It had
financial
exposed how
disagreements had
fragile
triggered the
loyalty
rift.
can be inside a
Yet he
high-stakes
refused to
world where
publicly
pride,
undermine
money,
the franchise
and
that had
identity
changed
are
his
all
life.
tangled together. For Big Chief, the silence he eventually broke publicly was only part of the
I
story.
ain't against nobody.
The
Big
deeper
Chief
story
told a
was about
confidant one
trust,
evening in
and
March
trust,
as
once
loyalty to
broken,
one side
does
of an
not heal
unspoken
easily.
divide
As
that
winter
had once
tightened
felt
its hold on the
unshakable.
Midwest racing
Longtime
scene, one
allies who
truth
once
became
called daily
impossible to
as though
ignore.
someone had
Street
retuned an
Outlaws
engine
was
without
no
asking
longer
the
dealing
driver.
with simple
But
rivalries.
privately it felt like something
It
closer
was
to
facing a
displacement.
reckoning, and
For
the
the first time
brotherhood
in
would not
years,
come
he was
through
watching
unchanged.
certain major
The deal
race
that
nights
changed
unfold
everything
from the
long before the
outside,
public
not
controversy
banned,
reached its
not
height
exiled.
in early
In the subtle
2026. There had
reshuffling
been a
of
meeting
authority
that
during
almost no one
televised
outside
events.
the inner circle
The shift
ever
did
heard
not
about.
arrive
That
with a
IT
dramatic
wasn't dramatic
announcement.
on the surface.
It crept in
No
through
yelling,
absence.
no
The
slammed
consequences
doors,
of Big
just a
Chief's
long
decision
table,
were no
tense
longer
faces,
theoretical.
and
It
paperwork
was a
that
refusal
felt
to
heavier
become a
than
symbol
any
of
engine
something he
block
no
sitting
longer
in a garage.
recognized.
That meeting
Realized
quietly
something had
changed the
shifted.
future
The
direction of
fracture
Street
was already set.
Outlaws,
It was a consequence.
and placed Big
The
Chief
deal
in the
that
hardest
changed everything
position of
did
his
not
career.
only
The
a controlled
franchise had
distance
grown
that
far
gradually
beyond its
became visible
original
to
shape.
fans. When he
What
ultimately
started as raw
declined
street
certain
racing in
aspects of the
Oklahoma City
restructuring,
had expanded
time
into
to weigh
structured
loyalty
tournaments,
against evolution,
national rankings,
time to
and
determine
spin-offs
whether
that
Spirit
required
had
much
officially
tighter
become
coordination.
mainstream
With
enterprise.
growth came revised
He did not
contracts,
storm out of that
broader
meeting.
insurance
He
requirements,
did not issue
and a clearer
ultimatums,
chain of command
yet it
that no
required a
longer
surrender of
depended on
organic
one dominant
chaos.
voice.
The very
The
element
change
that
was
built
presented
the
as
deal on the
progress,
table was not
a way to
villainous,
secure the
and that
show's
is what made
future
it
and protect
complicated.
everyone
Core
involved
of
from
his
the wild
conflict.
unpredictability
Because
that
for
once
Big Chief,
defined it.
one
Big
cast
Chief
member
listened
cautioned
carefully.
him during a late-night
But those
conversation.
close to him
Few
later
openly
said his
opposed the
face changed when
restructuring,
the
but fewer
discussion
still
turned to
openly
leadership
defended him.
restructuring.
Some
The
were
informal
eager for the
influence he
stability
had
and
long
expanded
held over
reach.
rankings and race
Refusing meant
decisions was being
uncertainty
spread
and
more
potential
widely,
isolation.
moving into a collaborative,
Now that balance was codified in
production-guided
language
system.
that
On
felt
paper,
restrictive.
it sounded
For
fair and
years,
balanced.
Big Chief had
In
navigated the
reality,
tension
it felt
between
like displacement.
authenticity
They're calling
and
it
clauses
evolution.
limiting
He
spontaneous
reportedly
events
told a
outside
trusted
approved
friend
frameworks
afterward.
were all part of the proposal.
But it feels like
beyond racing,
replacement.
media appearances.
That one
To them,
sentence
this
captured
was
the
survival
emotional
strategy.
current no
To
one
Big
wanted to
Chief,
name
it was a
openly.
dilution
The
of
controversial
identity.
decision
It
he
stemmed
would
from a
later defend
realization
didn't
that
come
the
from stubborn
foundation was
pride.
being quietly rebuilt
It came
without
from
him at
realizing
its
the
center.
foundation was
Production
being
executives
quietly
argued
rebuilt
that
without
broader
him at the
oversight
center.
would protect the
Production
brand and
executives
create
argued that
consistent
wider
storytelling.
oversight would
They
protect the
believed a
brand and
centralized
create more
format would
consistent
attract new
storytelling.
audiences addressed directly.
They believed
They're
a
calling it
centralized
evolution,
format would
he
bring in new
reportedly
viewers
told a
while
trusted
reducing
friend
the
afterward,
unpredictable
but it
elements
feels
that
like
once threatened
replacement was
insurance
being
and sponsor
redistributed into a more
confidence.
collaborative,
This was a smart
production-guided
survival
system,
strategy.
and changed when the
To
conversation
Big
turned
Chief,
to
it felt
leadership
like a dilution of
restructuring. Everyone
identity.
involved,
The
from the
paperwork outlined
unpredictability that once
obligations that
defined
went
the
far
show,
beyond
and a
racing,
clearer chain of
media
authority that did not
appearances,
rely on
structured
one dominant
rivalries,
voice,
defined
had
story
expanded
arcs
into
for upcoming
structured tournaments,
seasons, and
national
clauses
rankings,
limiting
and
spontaneous
spin-offs that
events
demanded
outside
tighter
approved
coordination,
frameworks.
and
The
placed Big
streets were
Chief
no
in the most
longer
difficult
completely
position of
theirs.
his career, and
They were now
paperwork that
part
felt
of a
heavier
network
than any
asset.
engine
For
block
years,
sitting in a
Big
garage
Chief had
bay.
navigated the
B26,
difficult
long
line
before the
between
public
authenticity
controversy
and
reached its
entertainment
peak in
with
early
natural
25,
balance.
unchanging a reckoning.
Now that
One
balance
truth
was being
became
written into
unavoidable.
legal
Street
language that
Outlaws
felt
was no
restrictive.
longer
Signing
navigating
meant
simple
security,
rivalries. The
continued
silence he
visibility,
broke publicly
and
was
shared
only part of the
decision-making.
story. The deeper story was
Refusing
about
meant
trust.
uncertainty
It had
and potential
exposed the fragile
isolation.
architecture
The weight
of
of that
loyalty
choice
within
was
a
made
high-stakes
heavier by
environment
subtle
where
shifts
pride,
among
I
fellow
never wanted to
racers.
be against anybody, he
Some
would
were
later
eager
reflect,
for the
but I wasn't
stability
going to
and bigger
pretend
reach.
everything was fine either.
Others
Had created
stayed
the
quiet,
environment that now
unwilling to risk
challenged
their
his
own
place within it.
opportunities.
Growth
Few
had come at
openly
the cost
opposed
of
the
control,
restructuring,
yet
but
beneath
even
the tension,
fewer openly
something
stood
more
with him.
vulnerable
That
was
in private, the
unfolding
pressure
neatly
grew
into
stronger.
corporate
You
framework.
gotta think
Networks
about the
favored
future.
consistency.
One cast
Behind
member
closed
warned
doors,
him during a
financial
late-night talk in
considerations added
February
pressure.
2026.
Instead, murmurs carried
This
undertones of
ain't just
allegiance
about
to
now.
sides. Critics
The
argued
advice
that no
was
single
practical,
racer should
but it
control
didn't
the
touch the
direction of a
emotional heart of
national
his
phenomenon.
conflict.
And into
Because for
early
Big Chief, the
2026,
future meant nothing if it no
supporters
longer
accused
felt
certain
like theirs.
what
The
unsettled
deal
Big
on the
Chief
table
most
wasn't
was
evil,
not disagreement,
and that's exactly
but
what made
distance.
it complicated.
Meanwhile, change is
It
inevitable in
offered
racing,
growth,
but change
security,
without, he
and professional
reportedly told
polish,
a longtime
yet it
ally after
required
one
giving up
tense
the
event.
organic chaos
The
that had
response was
defined the
measured,
show
hitting
from
with
the
quiet
beginning.
caution. The
Accepting it
brotherhood
meant
that once
admitting that the
thrived on
underground
spontaneous
spirit had officially
friendships
become a
cooled without
mainstream
dramatic
enterprise that he didn't
confrontations.
storm out of
Text
that
messages
meeting.
slowed. Aligning
He
with the
didn't
new
issue
direction meant
ultimatums.
accepting a reality where his
He
presence
asked
was
for
no
time,
longer dominant.
time to think
The
about what
adjustment felt
compromise
abrupt.
really meant.
Loyalty was suddenly
Time to weigh
complicated.
loyalty
Rules
against
became
evolution.
standardized in ways that some
Time
felt
to
protected
decide
the
whether
brand
staying
but
would
restrained
preserve
the
the heart of
chaos that
Street
made it
Outlaws,
real.
or
Rankings were
quietly erase it.
reimagined,
When he
had given him
ultimately declined
influence from
parts
the
of the
beginning.
restructuring,
Now
it was
that
done
influence
without
felt
drama.
contested, because
There was
power had
no
always been a
explosive
sensitive
announcement,
subject within
only
the
a
group.
controlled
Discussions
distance that
turned
slowly
blunt.
became
You think this
visible
was
to
about
fans.
TV?
His
One
absence
veteran
from
racer
key
said
production
quietly
arcs
to a
wasn't
close friend,
accidental.
had triggered conversations
It was
that
the
had been
direct
simmering
result,
for years.
the deal that
Some
changed
racers
everything
believed the show
didn't
needed
explode in
evolution to
public view.
survive, was splintering
It
beneath the
unfolded
weight
in
of one
silence,
controversial
in
decision.
careful
At the
refusals
center
and
of it
measured
all
steps
stood Big
backward,
Chief,
and by
older,
the time
more
the
deliberate,
audience
and
realized
far more
something had
personal.
shifted,
The fracture lines
was already
inside
in
Street
place.
Outlaws
What
were no
almost
longer
no one
subtle.
understood understood
By
then
the
was
time
that his
winter settled
decision
where he
wasn't a
helped
rejection
build
of
still
growth.
reflected the values that
It
created
was a
it.
refusal
What no
to
one
become a
understood in
symbol
those
of
early
something he
weeks
no
was that the
longer
decision had
recognized,
cost him
and
more
that
than
difference
screen
would
time.
define
The more the
everything that
narrative
came
hardened
after.
against him.
Isolation at
But
full
silence
throttle
is
by the
rarely
time
emptiness.
spring
The
arrived in
foundation would crumble.
2026, the
The long others
consequences of Big
defended him
Chief's
fiercely,
decision were no
arguing
longer
that
just talk.
frustration turned to division.
They were
Comment
visible in
sections
attendance
erupted.
lists,
Television.
in promotional
As weeks
posters,
passed without a
in
clear
the
Big
quiet
Chief had always
reshuffling of
insisted
authority
that the
during
street remain
televised
the street.
events. The change
Unpredictable
didn't
and raw.
arrive with a big
Contracts were being
announcement.
revised. Expectations were
through
shifting,
absence,
and it was not
and
rooted in
absence
ego.
can be louder
Behind
than any
closed doors, the
confrontation when
conversations
everyone
had
already
grown
knows what it
intense.
means.
That
For
question
the first
lingered
time
long
in
before
years,
he
he
ever
was
spoke
watching
it
certain
publicly.
major
To
race
those closer
nights
to the
unfold from the
situation, it
outside.
felt like a line drawn in the
Not
sand.
banned.
Big Chief declined to participate in a
exiled.
format shift that would alter
Simply
how
not
races were
central.
structured.
That
Part of the
difference
streets
mattered
was being
publicly,
traded for something
but privately
shinier
it
and
felt
more
closer to
controlled, as
displacement.
if loyalty
The streets he
itself
helped
had
build
become
were still
negotiable.
roaring,
Some
yet
racers
the
aligned
rhythm felt
themselves with the
unfamiliar,
evolving
as though
structure
someone
of the
had
show,
retuned
about
an engine
call-outs and
without
rankings,
asking the
now
driver. The
searching for proof
isolation
that the
wasn't only
rumors were true.
professional.
Inside the Oklahoma
It seeped
racing
into
community,
personal
and the
relationships
absence of
that
his
once
voice
felt
was echoing
unbreakable.
louder than any
Longtime
engine at the
allies who
line,
used to
and
call
started
every day
feeling
now
like something
reached out
far more
carefully,
personal. Around
unsure
street
whether
outlaws
staying
had
close
stopped.
would be
Now,
seen as choosing
Big
one
Chief is
side of an
finally breaking his
unspoken
silence,
divide.
and what he reveals
No one
threatens to
wanted to
change
pick
everything
teams,
fans thought they
yet
understood.
silence often works as a choice. I
By
aimed
early
against
autumn
nobody.
of 2025,
Big Chief
the
reportedly
tension
told a
feeling
close
like
confidant
typical
one
racing
evening in
rivalry,
March
and started
2026.
Big Chief had
His voice
stepped back
steady
from a
but
major
carrying
production
frustration.
direction that many believed would
But I
define the
can't
next
fake it
era of
either.
the franchise. And the
That
absence
tension
fans
between
dissected every
diplomacy and
episode,
honesty became
every
his
social
private
media
struggle.
post, every missed appearance,
He
searching
understood
for
how his step back
conversations
looked from
turned
the
guarded.
outside.
Old friends who once
Yet he
argued openly
refused to
about
publicly
call-outs
attack
chose
the
their words
franchise that
carefully,
had
as if
changed his
loyal,
life.
embracing
Rumors grew
national
louder
tournaments
through
and
early
tighter
April.
production oversight, while others
Some
quietly
said financial
questioned whether the heart of the
disagreements had
streets was.
caused
The
the split.
controversy centered on a decision
Others
that appeared
insisted it was
simple on the
personality
surface.
clashes.
Big Chief and how authority was
A smaller,
distributed among
more
cast
persistent
members.
whisper
To
suggested
outsiders, it
health
looked like
concerns had
resistance to
influenced
change.
his choice.
To those closer,
That the
y'all think I
non-stop
just
pace
walked
of
away for
production
no
and
reason?
travel had
He would
taken a
later
toll
ask,
he didn't
his
want to
voice calm
advertise
but
that he
edged
neither
with fatigue.
confirmed
That
nor
question,
denied those
because
stories.
beneath the
Letting
speculation was a
speculation
truth few
swirl
considered.
without adding
The choice
fuel.
was not
Behind the
impulsive,
scenes, the
and it was
psychological
not. Production
weight was
schedules
heavier than
tightened
any
around
rumor.
new story
Racing
arcs
is
that some
identity.
felt
And
prioritized
identity doesn't
spectacle over
separate cleanly
authenticity.
from
Big Chief
visibility.
had always,
When
even under the
crowds
glare of
gathered
national
without
glare of
chanting his
national
name, it hit
television,
deeper than he
explanation,
expected.
frustration. Some
Not
accused
because
him
he
of
needed
clinging
the
to
attention,
control.
but
Others
because it
defend
marked
without
a
his
change in
leadership the
belonging.
foundation where
Street
he stayed
outlaws had
silent.
always
The more
thrived
the
on
more
rivalry
the
wrapped
narrative
in
often
brotherhood.
it is calculation
The spectacle
or pain
depended
or
on
both.
tension,
What no
but the
one it had
foundation
cost him
depended on
trust in
trust.
people he once
Without
considered
trust, every
family, and it
handshake
had
feels
forced him to
temporary.
confront
He
whether the
began
empire
questioning
he
which
helped build. The
relationships
storm
were
was
built
already
on real
forming.
brotherhood,
He simply
and
had
which were
not
held
stepped into
together
it
by
yet.
shared opportunity. One
Then, at the
especially
start of
quiet night in late
2026,
April
the
captured the
fracture,
change
what had once
perfectly.
been competitive tension,
An
now felt
independent
like something
event drew a
colder.
big crowd
The
curious to
brotherhood
see
that had
him
built the
race outside the
franchise from
show's
midnight
structured
street
format.
calls and handshake
The
agreements
turnout was
splintered,
strong,
no longer
the energy
silent,
electric,
but not fully
yet beneath
embraced
the
either.
adrenaline
His
there was a
refusal to
quiet
align with the
sadness that
new
he was proving
direction
a
had
point.
triggered others
But
believed
to
evolution
whom,
had
"You
become
good with
erosion.
this?"
In
a
private
fellow racer
garages
asked
across
as engines
Oklahoma and
cooled
beyond,
under fading
discussions
light.
this was
Big Chief
about
paused
power.
before
That
answering.
word echoed more than anyone
I'm good
cared
with
to
being
admit,
honest.
because power. Big Chief's
It
role
wasn't
as
bravado.
strategist, list keeper, and
It was
unofficial
conviction
leader
mixed with
had given him
uncertainty.
producers had
Isolation
begun
has a way of
amplifying new
sharpening
voices,
priorities.
introducing shifts in structure that
Stripped of
diluted the
formal
centralized
authority, he
authority he
rediscovered the
once
raw
held.
simplicity of
Rankings,
lining up just to
tournament-style
race,
events
not to
replaced
serve a
organic street
storyline.
calls.
The
Rule
absence of
for
structured
racers who
arcs
had built
allowed
reputations
spontaneity,
under Big
but
Chief's
it also
leadership.
highlighted what
The
had been
adjustment,
lost.
aligning
the
with
shared
him,
stage
meant
that
risking
once
diminished
united the brotherhood
opportunities
was
within
now
the evolving
fragmented.
franchise.
Meanwhile, the franchise
Aligning
kept
with the
moving
emotional
forward.
toll was not immediate,
New
but it was
faces
cumulative.
rose in prominence.
Friendships, invitations
Leadership
changed.
dynamics adjusted
Appearances were
smoothly on
calculated.
screen,
The brotherhood
reinforcing
trust
the idea
began
that no
operating
single
with
person
quiet.
is irreplaceable.
Big Chief
That
sensed
truth
it before
cut both
anyone said
ways.
it out loud. Feels
It proved
different,
the
don't
show's
it?
resilience,
He reportedly,
yet
everything
it challenged
changes.
the emotional
That answer
story
may have
that
been
once
honest, but
placed
it
him
cut
at the
deeper
center.
than intended.
Publicly, he
Changes
stayed
in evident
composed.
consensus breeds resentment.
Privately,
What
he
unsettled
wrestled with
fans
doubt.
became
Had
part
he
of the
misjudged?
fracture. Online debates
Had drawing that
intensified
line
through
cost
late
him more than it
2025
protected?
and
Those
into
questions
cast
surfaced
members of
during quiet
sidelining the
hours
very
when
man who
garages
helped
emptied
define
and
the
applause
franchise.
faded into memory.
Critics argued
Still,
the
he didn't
division
retreat
seeped into live
completely.
events. Crowds were
He
no
showed up
longer
at select
unified
events,
chants of shared
greeted
allegiance.
former rivals
Instead,
with careful
for a
warmth,
show that had
and
always
avoided
marketed
feeding the
unity
rumor
through
mill.
rivalry,
His restraint
the irony
confused
was
critics
stark.
who expected
Behind closed,
fireworks.
the franchise was expanding
It
into broader
reassured
markets.
supporters who
Sponsors
feared
expected
bitterness,
stability.
the isolation
Networks
at full throttle
authentic
wasn't
chaos
dramatic
does not
exile.
always translate neatly into.
It was a
Big
slow
Chief found himself
recalibration of
grappling with a
presence and
painful
purpose
paradox.
that he was neither
The very
hero nor
success he
villain,
helped
neither
cultivate
martyr
had
nor
created.
conqueror.
He began questioning whether
He
the
was a
Brotherhood
racer,
had ever been as
navigating
solid
the
as it
uncomfortable
appeared.
space
or whether
between
shared
legacy
ambition
and
had
evolution,
masked
and
fragile
as spring turned
alliances.
towards summer,
Success
one truth
magnifies
became
cracks
impossible
that
to
once
ignore.
seemed insignificant.
Silence had
I never
protected
wanted
him
the
for months,
controversial
but
decision had
isolation
become
had
more
taught
than a
him something
professional
far more
disagreement.
valuable.
It had
Had
exposed
forced him
money
to ask
and
whether his
identity
identity
intertwined.
depended on a
For
platform
Big Chief, the
or on
silence
principle.
and trust,
The answer
once
to that
fractured,
question
does
would
not
shape
repair
exactly what he
easily.
said
As winter
next.
tightened its grip on the
Big
Midwest
Chief
racing
speaks by
scene,
early
one
summer
truth it was
2026,
navigating
the
a
weight of
reckoning, and
months
the
of
brotherhood
silence
would
had
not
grown heavier
survive
than
unchanged.
controversy
There
itself,
had been a meeting that
pressing
few
against
outside
Big
the inner
Chief from
circle
every
ever
side
knew
until
about.
the lack
It was
of his
not
voice
dramatic
started
on the
feeling
surface.
more like
No
surrender than
shouting,
strategy.
no slam
Rumors had
doors,
multiplied
just a long
wildly,
table,
twisting his
tightened
decision into
expressions, and
stories of
paperwork.
ego,
That meeting would
betrayal,
quietly
money
alter the
fights,
course of
and
Street
personal
Outlaws and
grudges,
place Big
none
Chief.
of
The
which fully
franchise had grown
captured the
beyond
truth
its
he had
original
carried
blueprint.
quietly since
What
the
began as
restructuring
raw
talks
street
first
competition
began.
in
Friends
Oklahoma
urged
City,
him to speak
with
sooner.
expansion came revised
Critics said
contracts,
his
broader
silence
insurance
proved guilt.
clauses, and a clearer. The shift
Supporters
was framed as
demanded
progress,
answers,
an
yet he
effort to
waited,
secure
knowing that
longevity and
once
protect
words were out,
everyone
they couldn't
involved.
be
Big
taken
Chief
back or
listened
reshaped.
carefully.
When he
But those
finally
close
broke
to him
that
later
silence
said
in
his
late June
expression changed when
2026, it
the
wasn't
informal
because the
influence
pressure
he
had
once
become
held over
unbearable.
rankings and
It
race
was because the
decisions
story
was
forming
being
without him
on
no
paper.
longer matched
It sounded
reality,
balanced.
and he
In
refused
practice,
to
it
let
felt like
speculation define a
displacement. They're
choice
calling
rooted
it
in
that
conviction
single
rather
line
than
captured
conflict,
the
that he didn't
emotional
appear angry,
undercurrent no one
triumphant,
wanted to address
or wounded
directly.
in the
The
dramatic way
controversial
some
decision he
expected.
would later defend did not
He was
erupt from
measured and
stubborn
deliberate,
pride.
as though
It
he had
stemmed
spent
while
months rehearsing
stabilizing
honesty
unpredictable
instead of
elements that
defense. That
once
he
threatened
started by
insurance
addressing
and
the
sponsor
controversy
confidence.
head-on,
To them,
admitting
the
that
paperwork
stepping
laid
away
out
from certain
obligations
production
that extended
directions had
beyond
shaken
race,
the
structured
foundation of Street
rivalries,
Outlaws and
defined
left
arcs
fans
for upcoming
confused.
seasons,
But he
and
insisted
clauses.
that
The streets
confusion
were
isn't
no
the
longer
same as
entirely
betrayal.
theirs.
The growth
They
of
were
the
part of a
franchise,
network
he
asset.
said,
For
was
years,
once something he
and
celebrated
entertainment,
completely,
with instinctive
because none of
balance.
them ever imagined
Now that
how far those
signing meant
late-night
security,
street races
continued exposure,
would travel
and shared
beyond
authority.
Oklahoma asphalt.
Refusing,
Yet
the weight of
somewhere
that
along
choice
that
was
journey,
compounded by
expansion
subtle
started feeling
shifts
like
among fellow
transformation,
racers.
and
Some were
transformation
eager,
started
others
feeling
remained
like
quiet,
dilution. And he could
unwilling
no
to
longer
jeopardize
separate success
opportunities.
from sacrifice
Few
without
open-
asking
in
what
private,
exactly was
the
being
pressure
sacrificed.
intensified.
That he spoke
You got to
slowly,
think about the future.
choosing words that
One
avoided
cast in
blame,
February of
emphasizing that
2026.
no single person was
This ain't just
responsible
about
for the
now.
shift.
The
Because
advice was
evolution in
practical,
television
but
rarely
it failed to
depends on
address
one
the
decision,
emotional core
but
of
on
his
a series
The
of
future meant
gradual
nothing if it no
adjustments.
longer felt like theirs.
That build until the
deal
original
it offered
vision
growth,
is barely
security, and
recognizable.
professional
What
polish.
bothered him most,
Yet it
he
required the show's
explained,
identity.
wasn't losing authority
Accepting
or
it
screen
meant
time.
acknowledging that
It was
the
feeling
underground
that
spirit had
authenticity was being
He asked for
redefined by
time.
committee rather
Time
than
to
lived
consider what
experience. That he
compromise
reminded
meant.
everyone that
Time to
leadership on the
staying would
streets had never been about
preserve
control,
the heart of
but
street
about
outlaws
keeping order
or
inside
quietly
chaos,
erase
so
it.
racers
When
could
he ultimately,
compete hard
it was
without
done without
descending into
spectacle.
recklessness.
There was no explosive
When
announcement.
that structure
Only
shifted into
his
formal
absence
oversight,
from key
guided
production
more
arcs
by
was not
production,
accidental. It was a
safeguards than
public
racer
view.
instinct.
It
He felt
unfolded
the
in
balance
silence,
tip in a way
in
he
careful
couldn't ignore. That he
refusals and
tackled
measured
the
steps
accusation
backward.
of wanting control
And by the
directly,
time the audience
explaining
realized
that influence
what no
is
one
often
understood then
confused
was
with
that his
ownership,
decision
and
was
he
not
never
a
believed
rejection of
street
growth.
outlaws belonged
It
to
was
him
a
alone.
and that
What he did
distinction would
believe was
define
that
everything that
responsibility
followed.
comes with influence, and he took that
By the time
responsibility
spring of
seriously.
2026
Because
arrived,
the early
the
seasons were built
they
on
were
trust
visible in
rather than
attendance
scripted
lists, in
storylines.
promotional posters. In the
He
subtle
described
and
meetings where
absence can be
revised
louder than
contracts emphasized
confrontation when everyone
predictability and
knows what it
centralized
means.
decision-making.
For the first time,
Changes
simply
meant to
not
protect
central.
sponsors
That
and
distinction
network
mattered
interests,
publicly,
yet changes
but
that
privately,
also
the
limited
streets
the
he helped
spontaneity
elevate
that
were
once
still
defined
roaring,
their identity.
yet the
That he
rhythm
admitted
felt
that
unfamiliar,
compromise was
as though
discussed at length,
the
that
isolation
he
was not
considered
just
signing
professional.
off on the new
It
structure
seeped
to
into
keep
personal
unity,
dynamics
and that
that
the
had once
financial
felt,
incentives
now reached
were
out
real.
cautiously.
But every
Unsure
time
whether
he revisited
association
the
would be
terms, he felt
interpreted
a
as
quiet
loyal. No
resistance,
one wanted to
a
choose
sense that
teams,
agreeing
yet silence often
would mean
functions as a
staying
choice.
silent in moments
I ain't
when
again
honesty mattered
2026.
more. That he made
His
it clear
voice
his
steady,
decision
but
wasn't
edged
an
with
attempt to
frustration.
sabotage progress,
But
but
authenticity
a
became his
refusal to
private
endorse a
battle.
direction
He
that no
understood
longer
the
felt
optics of
aligned with
stepping
the
back.
culture he helped
Yet he
create.
refused.
I wasn't
Rumors
trying to win
intensified
anything,
through early
he said
April.
calmly.
Some
I was
others
trying to stay
insisted
real with
personality
myself.
conflicts were to blame.
That statement
small
reframed
production
the
and
whole
travel
controversy,
had taken a
turning
toll
it
he
from a
preferred
power
not to
struggle into a
advertise.
negotiation
He
with
neither
conscience.
was heavier
And
than
the
any
difference
rumor.
was huge. He
Racing
owned his
is
mistakes,
identity.
admitting
An
that
identity
maybe his
not because he
communication
craved
could have been
attention,
clearer earlier,
but because it
and that pride
symbolized a
might have
shift in
sharpened some
belonging.
disagreements
Street out,
unnecessarily.
the spectacle
Yet he
depended
stood
on
firm in
tension,
believing that
but the
growth without
foundation depended
integrity
on
would
trust.
eventually erode the
Without
loyalty
trust,
the
he began
franchise
questioning which
depended on.
relationships were rooted in
The hardest
genuine
part,
brotherhood
he
and which were
confessed,
night
was
in late
watching
April
friendships
captured the
strain.
shift perfectly.
Under
An
pressure,
independent
neither
event
he
drew
nor
a
they
crowd
fully
curious.
understood
The
at the
turnout
time.
was strong. the energy
There were
electric,
nights when he
yet
wondered whether
beneath
drawing
he
that
was
line
proving a
had cost
point.
him
But
relationships
to
that
whom?
once felt permanent,
You good with this?
and that
A
uncertainty
fellow
weighed
Rick.
heavier
Big
than any
Chief paused
professional
before answering.
consequence. As
I'm
his
good
statement
with being
continued, the
honest.
tone shifted
It was
gently
not
from
priorities.
explanation to
Stripped
reflection,
of formal
showing
authority,
layers
he
rarely seen
rediscovered
beneath his
competition
calm
rather than
exterior. That he
narrative.
talked about the
The
mental
absence
cost
of
of
structured
constant
story
scrutiny,
arcs allowed
about
for
being
the
cast
shared
as either
stage that
hero
once
or
unified the
obstacle in
brotherhood
stories written
was now
without his
fragmented.
input. The endless
Meanwhile, new
speculation had
faces
forced
gained
him
prominence.
to
Leadership
face parts of
dynamics
himself
adjusted
he rarely
seamlessly. No
examined in
individual
public,
was indispensable.
including doubts
That
about who he was
realization
beyond
cut
the
both
show. That he
ways.
admitted the
It
pressure
affirmed
to embody
positioned
a
him as
symbol
central.
rather than a person had
Publicly,
blurred the line
he
between
remained
public
composed.
expectation and
Privately,
private peace.
had drawing
People
a
think
boundary
it's
cost
just
him more
racing,
than it
he
preserved.
said quietly.
Those questions and applause
They don't
faded
see
into
what it
memory.
does to your head.
Still, he did not
That admission
greeted
carried
former
a
rivals with
vulnerability that
measured
surprised
warmth
many,
and avoided
because
fueling
strength had always been
speculation.
his defining
His
trait on
restraint
screen. That he
reassured
clarified
supporters
there was
who
no
feared
explosive
bitterness.
fallout,
The
no
isolation
single
at full
dramatic
throttle was not
confrontation that
dramatic
triggered his
exile.
choice,
It was a
but
slow.
rather a
He was neither
gradual
hero nor
realization
villain,
that continuing
neither martyr
under
nor
terms he
conqueror.
didn't believe in
He
would
was a
slowly
rake between
destroy his
legacy and
self-respect.
evolution.
That he emphasized,
And as
he
spring
held no
turned toward
resentment
summer,
toward those who
one
chose
truth,
differently,
but isolation had
acknowledging
taught him
that every
something more
racer has
valuable.
to navigate
It had
opportunity
principle.
and principle.
The answer to that question would
According
shape
to
what
their
he
own
said
compass,
next.
his decision, he insisted,
The weight of
wasn't
months
about
of
claiming
silence had grown
superiority.
heavier than any
It was about
controversy
alignment.
itself.
That he reaffirmed
Pressing
his
again
love
began
for
to
racing,
feel like surrender
describing
rather
it
than
not as
strategy.
entertainment but as
The rumors
identity woven
twisting
into
his
his life
decision
long
into
before
narratives of
cameras
ego,
ever showed up.
betrayal
That passion,
quietly
he
since the
said,
restructuring
remains
talks first
unchanged,
began.
even if the framework
Friends,
around it
when he
evolves.
finally
That
chose
he
to
ended by
break that
expressing
silence
hope
in
that
late June
dialogue
of
could replace
2026,
division. That
it was
mutual
not, but
respect
because
might
the story
eventually
forming
bridge the
without
gap
him no
between
longer
different
resembled
visions.
reality,
When
and he refused
he
rather
finished,
than
there was no
conflict.
dramatic
He
declaration,
did not appear angry,
no
nor
triumphant return promised,
nor wounded,
no
as
final
though he
line
had spent
drawn
months
across the
rehearsing
future of
honesty
street
rather than
outlaws.
defense.
Instead, there was
He
clarity,
began from certain
and clarity
production
often
directions
hits
had
harder
shaken
than
the
spectacle.
foundation of
The
Street
months of
Outlaws,
silence had
and
been
left
seen as
fan had been
avoidance,
something he
but in
once
truth they
celebrated
had been
wholeheartedly,
reflection. Why
because none
breaking
of
that
races would
silence, he
travel
didn't seek
beyond Oklahoma
validation.
asphalt.
He sought understanding.
Yet somewhere
The
along that
controversy
journey,
didn't vanish
expansion,
instantly.
and he could no
Critics
longer
stayed skeptical,
separate success
but the
from
tone of
sacrifice.
conversation
Without
shifted
asking,
from
he
accusation
spoke
to
slowly, choosing words that
consideration.
avoided
His
blame.
words showed the decision was neither
because
impulsive
evolution
nor
in television
hostile,
rarely
but
hinges
deliberate
on
and
one
personal.
decision,
That in
but
choosing
on a
to
series
speak, he
print is
reclaimed
barely
authorship
visible.
of his own
What
story,
unsettled him
not
most,
to tear
he
down what
explained,
he helped
was
build,
not loose
but to
authenticity
define
was
his
being
place inside
redefined
its
by
evolution.
committee,
The
rather
engines
than
would
lived
keep roaring.
experience. He reminded
franchise
about
would keep
maintaining order
adapting.
within chaos so racers
Rivalries
could
would
compete
keep
fiercely.
igniting,
When that
but his
structure
boundary
shifted
had
into
been set
formal
without
oversight,
bitterness.
governed more.
That
He felt the balance tilt in a way he could not ignore. He addressed the accusation of control head-on, explaining, and he never believed Street Outlaws belonged to him alone. What he did believe, however, was that and he carried that responsibility seriously, because the early seasons were built on trust, rather than changes designed to protect sponsors and network interests. Yet change, he admitted that compromise was discussed extensively, that he considered, and that the financial incentives were not insignificant. But each time, he made it clear that his decision was not an attempt to sabotage progress, but a refusal. I wasn't trying to win anything, he said calmly. I was trying to stay real with myself. That statement into a negotiation with conscience, and the difference was substantial. He acknowledged mistakes, conceding that perhaps his communication could have been clearer earlier, and that pride might have sharpened certain disagreements unnecessarily. Yet he stood firm in the belief that growth without integrity would eventually erode the very loyalty the franchise depended upon. The hardest part was watching friendships strain under pressure neither he nor they fully understood at the time. There were nights when, and that uncertainty weighed heavier than any professional consequence. As his statement, he spoke about the mental toll of constant scrutiny, about being the relentless speculation had forced him to confront parts of himself he rarely examined publicly, including doubt. He admitted that the pressure to embody a symbol rather than a person had blurred boundaries between public expectation and private peace. People think that admission carried vulnerability that surprised many, because strength, he clarified that there was no dramatic fallout, no explosion, but rather a gradual realization that continuing under terms he did not believe in would erode self-respect over time. He emphasized acknowledging that each racer must navigate opportunity and principle according to their own compass. His choice, he reaffirmed his love for racing, describing
crowds
it
that
not
showed
as
up were
entertainment
curious
but as
but
identity,
supportive,
woven
drawn
into
not just
that
by
passion,
nostalgia,
he said,
but by genuine
remains
interest in
unchanged,
seeing how
even
he
if
would
the
navigate
framework
a world
surrounding it
no longer
evolves.
centered on
He
a
concluded
national
that
platform,
mutual
yet
respect
still
might eventually
shaped by
bridge
his
the
legacy
gap
that he
between
didn't perform
divergent
defiance.
visions. When he finished speaking, and
He
no
didn't diminish
finality
the
imposed upon the
franchise he helped
future of Street
create.
Outlaws.
Instead, he let his
the
actions
months
speak
of
through steady
silence had been
consistency
interpreted as
rather than
avoidance,
dramatic gestures.
but in truth
There
they
were
had been
moments of
reflection.
reflection he
By
didn't
breaking
hide in
but the
private
tone of conversation
conversations,
shifted from
acknowledging that
accusation
building
to
something
consideration.
powerful enough
His
to
words were,
outgrow its
the engines
founders
would
is both a
continue to
victory
roar,
and a
the
reckoning.
franchise would
create
continue
something
to
big.
adapt,
He
and
reflected
rivalry,
during
but his
one
boundary
quiet
had
talk
been
in
drawn
July
without bitterness.
2026.
In that moment, the
And
controversy
eventually
becomes
it
something
belongs
far
to
more
more than
powerful
you.
than rumor.
That recognition carried
Something
no
subtle
bitterness,
but undeniable,
only acceptance,
shifted within the
as though
world
he
of
had
Street
come
Outlaws.
to terms with the
Not an
paradox that
but a
legacy often
recalibration that
requires
could be
letting
felt
go.
in tone,
The controversial
in
decision that
conversation,
once
and
looked
in the
like
way as
rebellion now
clarity
revealed
replaced
itself as a
speculation
boundary,
and context
boundaries,
replaced accusation.
though painful,
And for the first
can
and more
preserve
on why
dignity
he had
when
done
alignment
it. The
fails.
franchise
The
continued
franchise
forward,
itself showed
tournaments
resilience,
progressed, leadership
continuing
yet
to
his
draw
absence
viewers
from
and
certain
maintain
arcs
momentum
no longer
despite
felt
the
like
public
exile
fracture,
but like
proving
intention,
that evolution
and that
doesn't
distinct
depend on
conversations
any single
resumed that had once
personality.
stalled under tension.
No
Not
matter
grand
how central
reunions
that
staged for
personality
optics,
once seemed,
but measured
yet the story
dialogues
had
between
permanently
men who had
matured,
shared too many
because
late
fans
nights
now
and too
understood
much
that
asphalt to let
authenticity and
silence
structure
become
don't always
permanent.
live
They were
together
acknowledged
easily,
that pride
and
and
that
pressure
growth
had
sometimes
complicated what
requires
might have
tension
been
rather than
navigated with
agreement.
greater
The
transparency.
conversation around
And though
Street
no one,
Outlaws
there was a
became
growing
more
understanding
layered,
that the
less
fracture
divided,
had been
with
structural rather
supporters
than
and critics
personal.
discussing
Some racers
ownership,
admitted
loyalty,
quietly that they
and
respected
creative
his stance
control
even if
instead
they
of simply
disagreed with
picking
it,
sides.
because standing.
For
Meanwhile,
Big Chief, the
Big Chief
aftermath
settled
wasn't
into a
about
rhythm that
reclaiming
felt both familiar and
dominance
foreign.
or proving
Participated
doubters
long
wrong.
before
It was
television
about
cameras ever
redefining
illuminated his
participation on
name.
his own
The
terms
crowds
that
that
he stayed
eager to see
visible
how
in
he
the
would
racing
navigate a
world.
world no
Yet the
longer
need to
centered on a
occupy the
national
central
platform,
spotlight had
yet
faded,
still he did not
replaced by
perform
a steadier
defiance,
sense of
nor
self
did he
not
diminish
tied
the
to network
franchise he
decisions.
helped build.
The months of
Instead, there were
silence
moments of
followed by deliberate
introspection he
speech
did
had
not shy away
clarified
from in
priorities
private
that once felt
conversations,
tangled in
acknowledging is
expectation.
both a triumph
Racing
and a
remained
reckoning.
passion.
You
But
create
peace
something
had
big,
become just
he
as
reflected
valuable.
during one
As
quiet
summer
exchange
moved
in
toward
July of
fall in
2026, and
the
eventually,
dust that once
as though he had
clouded.
come to terms with the paradox
Everything
that
had mostly
legacy often
settled,
requires
revealing
release.
a landscape
The controversy
changed,
and
but still
boundaries,
standing.
though
Street
uncomfortable,
Outlaws
can preserve
continued its
dignity
path.
when alignment falters.
Big
The
Chief
franchise continuing to attract
occasionally
viewership
crossing
and
paths
maintain
through shared
momentum
history,
despite the public
but no
fracture,
longer
proving
dependent
that
on the same
evolution does
direction.
not hinge
There
on
was
a
no
single
grand
personality,
finale,
no
no
matter how,
explosive
because
showdown
fans
to
now
close the
understood that
controversy,
authenticity
only
and
the
structure
quiet
do not always
acknowledgement that different
coexist
visions
seamlessly,
can exist
and that
side
growth,
by
the
side
discourse
without
surrounding
erasing
Street
each other.
Outlaws became
In the
more
end, what
layered,
remained
less
wasn't division,
polarized, with
but
support,
evolution.
loyalty, and creative
Not
control,
betrayal,
rather
but
than simply
divergence.
choosing sides.
Not
For Big
silence,
Chief, but about
but
redefining
understanding.
participation
The engine
on his
still
own
roared
terms.
under
He
Oklahoma
remained
skies.
replaced by a steadier sense of
Rivalry
self,
still
not
sparked.
tethered to network decisions.
The culture
months
that
of
began on
silence,
dark streets
followed by
kept going.
racing remained
Even as its
passion,
shape changed,
but peace had
Big
become
Chief had
equally
broken
valuable.
his silence,
As summer,
not
the
to
dust
start a
that
war,
once clouded
but to define
perception had
himself
largely
inside
settled,
change.
revealing
And
a
after
land,
the
and
smoke
Big Chief
cleared, that
continued
definition
his,
stood
occasionally
firm, neither
intersecting
louder
in
nor
shared
weaker
history,
than
but no
before.
longer dependent
Simply
on
his
identical
own.
direction.
Big Chief
There was
chose
no
clarity
only
over
the
comfort,
quiet
and whether
acknowledgement
you
that
agree
different
with his
visions can
decision or not,
coexist without
the
erasing
impact
one
on
another.
Street Outlaws
In the
is
end,
undeniable.
not betrayal but divergence.
Now we
and
want
not
to hear from
silence
you.
but
Was he
understanding.
protecting the
The
culture,
engines,
or
rivalry
resisting
still
necessary?
sparked, and the culture that began
Evolution.
on dark streets
Drop your thoughts
persisted,
below and
even as
join
it's
the
but to define
conversation.
himself within
Music
change.
fades.
And after the smoke